When the Alliance was formed, we knew we had an important task ahead. Our concern was centered around the fact that the Holocaust, this human disaster, was being trivialized, ignored, or denied. One of the major events in modern history whose consequences still affect the political and cultural acts of many nations, and the observance and theology of many of the major churches was not being addressed by our educational institutions. The purpose of the Alliance is to promote and encourage knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust among students and the general public. The Alliance is a community organization. It represents a number of organizations in Sonoma and adjacent counties. We have members at large, individuals to help support our aims. We also represent a number of people who make generous contributions to finance the cost of offering these lectures. These are public lectures, open to students and public members without charge. Students have the opportunity to enroll in courses which include the lectures. Community members also may take Holocaust course through the extended education office. For those who need them, I have flyers here so that you can provide information about the whole series. When the lecture series was started, a small group of faculty worked with the Alliance and helped in planning and preparing the lectures. 4 years ago, the university established the Holocaust Study Center. Dr. John Steiner is the director. John Steiner is also a survivor of the Holocaust. Since then, it has been our pleasure to collaborate and work with the center in presenting these lectures. Now, this is the first meeting, and there's a lot of housekeeping business to take care of. And the first person who's going to address that is Dr. Gene Kravitz.
Good afternoon. I am also with the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, and I have a few announcements which may help you with some source material for this course. The first, this weekend at the Sonoma Film Institute, there are 2 films. One is called Goddesses Remembered, and The Burning Times. They deal with the Holocaust of women, the burning of witches. And from my own studies, and I will give you a reference here, I believe there's a direct connection to the subject matter we're discussing in these lectures. I'd like to read a few lines here for you. The most common elements that the accusers wanted in a confession were: 1, a pact with the devil; 2, riding by night; 3, the formal repudiation of Christianity; 4, secret nocturnal meetings; 5, the desecration of the Eucharist and the crucifix; 6, an orgy; 7, sacrificial infanticide; 8, cannibalism; and 9, the raising of tempests of storms. Now, the following accusations were made against the Jews. They were in the folklore in the 19th century. Jews were children of the devil, pact with the devil. That's one. The desecration of the host, the desecration of the Eucharist. This was considered something that the Jews did in the folklore. Sacrificial infanticide, the killing of a Christian child. This is a horrible one. The killing of a Christian child to bake matzah, the bread for Holocaust, for Passover, came directly out of the Holocaust of women. This book is called Woman as Healer. I would recommend it, by Jean Achterberg. It's a very recent book. The next is, there is a subscription in the library for this journal called Dimensions. This is a rather new journal. It's volume 5. It's 5 years old. The university has most of the back issues, and we are trying to find the few that they're missing. It's called Dimensions, Journal of the Holocaust Studies, published by the Anti-Defamation League Braun Center for Holocaust Studies in New York. It is the only journal of its kind, I do believe, in the United States. There's another journal that's published in Europe. Yehuda Bauer from the Yad Vashem Holocaust Center is the editor. This one is right here in the journal, in the library. If you want to purchase your own subscription, it's very, very reasonable. It's $12 a year, or 2 years for $20. Now, the format of the journal is they take a theme just like we have taken a theme. And it just so happens that this new quarterly issue is concerned with the same theme we are. It's called Moral Courage During the Holocaust. Okay. Another source for you is those of you who have not used our public library system since the new computers are in. They have a fairly extensive Holocaust library there, and it's very, very easy to do your research. All you do is type in Holocaust, and out comes your bibliography. You can take it home with you. Simply any public library, from Petaluma up to Cloverdale, I guess. So that's a source for you. And finally, we have for the past 4 or 5 years been taping these lectures, and the program is that the lecture from the previous week should be in the library, ready for circulation, with a log posted up there by the following lecture. So, good luck to you all, and I hope we have I'm looking forward to a very good series this year. Thank you. Carol? Okay.
Hi, I'm Carol Hurwitz, and I would also like to welcome you to the lecture series. I'm a graduate student here in all of the Holocaust committees on campus, and I would like to point out that the speakers that we're using here are not for sound. Unfortunately, they're only for the videotapers, so that if you can't hear one of us, you're going to have to signal that to us so that we can project out louder, because we don't actually have a sound system in place. It may look like it because we have a lot of equipment here, but that's not the case. In terms of administrative details, I would just like to give a brief overview of what we planned today for our session. First, we're going to be having a panel of 4 faculty members from Sonoma State University's staff here, speaking on ideas of genocide, and beginning the session with an attempt to define and describe what we mean by genocide today. This will go on for about 40 minutes. We're going to give them about 10 minutes apiece, and then they would like the chance to ask questions of each other in relation to their presentations. Then we'll open it to the discussion of the audience, questions and comments that you have. In the last 20 minutes or so, we would like to break down into the 9 different disciplines that are associated with this interdisciplinary series, so that each of you can meet your faculty and go over your syllabus and the requirements for your course, and any other questions or concerns that you might have at that time. So that don't run off at the end. Most of the faculty are here to be introduced to you, so that you can feel more comfortable knowing who they are. It's sometimes difficult in such a large class to connect with your particular faculty and know what is expected of you, and also if you have particular questions related to your discipline that can be addressed. It's my privilege today to introduce the panel. Would you like to come down and take your seats? I'm afraid we don't have water today. If you get a dry throat, you're going to have to go out to the water fountain because we didn't take care of that. I'm going to pull the chairs over a little bit, maybe. Jean, in terms of this one, I should give to whoever's speaking, right?
Well, no, you're going to use the 2-table one from now on.
So then what do I...
That's off.
That's off. It's off from now on or after I finish? Yes, I would like to. The subject of our panel today is genocide, reality, and moral implications. It's hardly an easy or a pleasant topic. In fact, it may be one of the most difficult and yet most crucial intellectual, political, and moral issues we have to face in our time. Certainly, it's impossible to avoid knowledge of it in an era of mass media and satellite communications. I want to recommend each of you in the audience for having the moral and intellectual courage to approach this subject. And hopefully we can provide a supportive atmosphere for exploring it effectively. These four faculty who are assembled in front of you are all people who have committed themselves to an honest and thoughtful exploration of this subject, what genocide means to us today. And this semester they're going to lead us in this exploration and discussion. Professor John Steiner, you're not quite in order here, but he's with the white hair and the tie, of the sociology department, is director of the Sonoma State University Holocaust Studies Center. He's an international scholar and a Holocaust survivor. Professor Bob Brown, in the blue check shirt, teaches in the history department and is coordinator for the Holocaust Studies Center and Holocaust Faculty Committee. Professor Victoria Bomberry, on the end, is from the Ethnic Studies Department and is a Native American of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma. She's also director of an she might have a chance to tell us about called State of Our Nation. Victoria is new to our faculty group, and I want to welcome her and thank her for joining us. Professor Harold Aldernman of Sonoma State's Philosophy Department is our resident philosopher, and I'll leave it at that.
One of our residents.
One of our residents. Well, the one for the Holocaust faculty group. Shall I bring this back to you?
I'm not going to do it.
So let's start with just few introductory remarks and see how we can link our program with the present world situation, which of course is a concern for all of us because so many people in the world will be affected by it. I usually speak off the cuff and don't like to read, but because something needs to be prepared also for the press, I felt that it's going to be for me to do both at one time and make these sort of remarks to you, hoping that they'll be specific enough so that they will provide us with some sort of a basis of understanding in terms of what we are up to. So in these tragic times, the theme of our lecture series has a very special relevance. Today we are again witnessing a historical moment which an avoidable escalation of violence is unraveling right before our eyes. What will the outcome be? What will be the consequences, the moral implications? The economic, the ecological, the geopolitical, and possibly specific towards us directed backlash by the Arab nations might be an out, just to name a few, but above all, what will be the cost in human lives? What responsibility are we prepared to assume as accountable citizens? Are we going to behave differently than the Germans during the Third Reich? After the war, they claimed to have known nothing about the Holocaust. No one had been a Nazi. No one knew anything about concentration camps, but everyone was afraid to get into one. Children were told by parents, if you don't behave, you will be sent to Dachau. Today, Saddam Hussein can wage a chemical and biological war and actually has used poison gas against approximately 200,000 Kurds already, years before he had become our enemy. A capability he had obtained from German manufacturers, including his possession of rockets. But not only, be it as it may, we need to obtain greater clarity in these matters to wage what it is claimed to be a just war. We need facts and evidence, reasonable and rational thinking, and decision-making laced with concern and compassion. During the late 1950s and 60s, Holocaust became the widely used term for the extermination of the European Jews, setting this particular instance apart from the event is its unimaginability, its unrelatability. Because of its complexity, it is essential to look at the Holocaust or genocide from an interdisciplinary point of view. This is one of the major reasons why we have representatives of many disciplines in our Holocaust and Genocide Study Center to collaborate and work together to shed light into this ghastly nightmare, which has become reality because citizens like you and me permitted it to happen. They either directly supported and identified with Nazi ideology, were fellow travelers, collaborators, or were silent individuals looking the other way, ignored what's going on because it did not directly concern or affect them. Hence, the power elites' ideology justified their extermination, their eradication from the face of the earth, and to a very large extent, they almost succeeded. Let me now define genocide as we find it in the Encyclopedia of Sociology and use that as some sort of a basis for our discussion. Genocide, literally the destruction of a race or ethnic group, is what is meant by genocide in essence. Genocide is the deliberate, systematic killing of an entire people or nation. The term first came into use during World War II with regard to the unsuccessful attempt to destroy the Jewish people in Nazi Europe. American Indians were also victims of genocide. The term is also applied rhetorically in political slogans, for example, cultural genocide. This is what we have in terms of a very short, brief, specific definition of genocide from a sociological perspective. My colleagues will give you different definitions and different perspectives on genocide and see how we can come to terms different perspectives and agree on some sort of a definition which will be our working definition. Bob?
Thank you, John. Again, welcome to the Holocaust Lecture Series. My name is Bob Brown, and I'm a member of the History Department at Sonoma State. And I would like to just follow up and with a few historical considerations on the meaning of the term Holocaust and genocide. John has already defined them. Generally speaking, the word Holocaust without a capital has come to mean, from its biblical origins, has come to mean any great massacre of people. So any great massacre you could refer to as a Holocaust. With a capital H, the term Holocaust has come to mean the destruction of the European Jews during World War II. Although if you read the literature, say, of World War I, you can find reference to the Holocaust of World War I, no capital, in the sense that millions of soldiers were killed in the trenches of World War I in what one would have to obviously call a Holocaust. So that there is, you have to be clear with the terminology. What you mean by Holocaust with a small h, any general or great massacre, and Holocaust with a capital H, the specific massacre of the European Jews during World War II. Now, the term genocide has been subject to varying definitions, generally within the context of the United Nations. And in fact, there have been, as John has, one of the terrible things that you get into in a course like this is that when you study about the Holocaust, which is also the genocide of the European Jews during World War II, you have to start asking uneasy questions about, have there been other Holocausts in history or other genocides in history? And of course, there have been, particularly in connection with this country, as Victoria will speak about in a minute. In defining a genocide, I think the best definitions have been given through the UN. In 1946, because of the events of World War II, the UN General Assembly defined genocide as, quote, a crime under international law which the civilized world condemns, and for the commission of which principals and accomplices are punishable, unquote. Now, accomplices, I mean, it's pretty easy to distinguish who are the principals in a genocide. The word accomplices is a word heavy with moral meaning, because it essentially means that you run the risk, in a moral sense, if you did nothing to avoid a genocide, of being branded an accomplice. So that the word genocide should have a lot of meaning for everybody in the world. In 1948, the UN established a Convention on Genocide and the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And the convention went into effect in 1951. The purpose of that convention was to safeguard people, presumably everywhere in the world, but particularly minorities. In most historical cases, the people who are the object of genocidal activity are minorities of various sorts. And the second purpose of the Genocide Convention was to define basic moral principles, which presumably no decent human being would want to violate. It was important to note that genocidal activities can take place in so-called peacetime as well as war. So that even though there isn't a actual fighting war going on, it's conceivable under the Genocide Convention, a nation could be accused of participating in genocidal activities. Under the UN Convention, there was a kind of interesting omission that genocide was defined as a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Okay? The original definition of genocide had included the idea of a political group. The destruction of a particular political group would also be considered a crime of genocide. That was dropped out of the convention, probably because of the political disputes that were then going on in the world, notably the Cold War dispute between the ideologies of socialism and capitalism. But anyway, the crimes that are foreseen under the Genocide Convention of the UN include killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to a group, deliberately inflicting difficult conditions of life on a group that would lead to their physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within a particular group, and forcibly transferring the children of one group to another group. These are all covered within the convention of the UN Convention on Genocide. Now, responsibility and guilt are attached to those people who conspire, incite, attempt, or are in complicity with efforts at genocide. And they are punishable under international law from the ruler of the country through public officials down to the least individual within a country who takes part in the genocide. So it covers everybody. You can't just, as many Nazis did in World War II, you can't just say, I was following orders. That you as an individual under the UN Convention are responsible too. And the judgment of who is responsible for a genocide was left in the convention to a competent tribunal within a state in which the genocide had taken place, or by an international tribunal. Of course, the important thing is that another important aspect of the Genocide Convention is that genocide is not an internal matter. It is considered to be an international matter. And on behalf of other people in the world, if you can successfully make the charge of genocide, anybody any member of one nation or any nation's leadership can make the charge of genocide against any other nation in the world who has contracted to the Genocide Convention. So that there are obviously the events of the Holocaust of World War II focused attention on the crime of genocide, and that through the UN, legal mechanisms have been established to recognize and to punish the crime of genocide. With that historical background, I'll let Victoria pick up from here. Victoria?
My name's Victoria Bomberry, and I'm okay. I have a soft voice, so wave to me anytime I fade away. My name is Victoria Bomberry, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Native American Studies. I was asked to join this panel in the fall as a result of a lot of conversation that went on to really look at what genocide means, what Holocaust means in a modern context. And as I thought about it, I realized how much I had repressed our own experience as a Native American person. It's something that we're aware of, I think, as Native people, very aware of, but it's something that's very painful to deal with in any ongoing fashion. I started looking at some of the historical material relating to genocide, and it happens immediately upon arrival by Columbus, and then upon arrival by the English who came to this continent. I wanted to give you some population figures because I think it's really important to realize how many Native people were actually here. Some of the highest figures in America put the Native population at 12,250,000. And that's a fair number of people. Some of the lower figures put it down around 4,400,000 Native American people on this continent.
Including Mexico and South?
No, this is just in North America. So we get higher figures when we look at, all of the hemisphere. We get up around 35 million Native people. What makes the Native American experience very excruciating is the fact that people were exterminated. There's whole tribes of people who are gone. There's no known member of those tribes remaining. So they're gone. They're forever gone. It's like looking at what's happening right now in overall globally with the extermination of different things in this world. Once they're gone forever. There's no turning back. There's no regaining what's been lost. And that's something that I don't think Americans generally think about, that this has happened from the very beginning in North America. In the early 1800s, Tecumseh, who was a great Shawnee leader and political organizer, went around to different tribes because he had been watching what had happened. He had seen members of his own family murdered. He had seen the lessening of political power for the Native American groups and tribes that were in his area. And he went from tribe to tribe and he asked, where today are the Pequot? Where are the Narragansett, the Mohegan, the Pokanoket, and the other once powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice and oppression of the white man, as snow before a summer sun. And he had the particular vision to unite Native people to repulse Americans who were infringing on territory over and over again. And there were hundreds of Holocausts. The Americans came through and they burned villages systematically. They destroyed the crops. They destroyed the livelihood. They killed women and children and old people, as well as the warriors. So there were many Holocausts. The particular tribe that he began to ask about was the Pequot. The Pequot were some of the earliest people to greet the colonists who arrived here. And they were a very politically powerful group of people. They had formed alliances with tribes in their area. They had a very powerful political system, and they had... The process unfolded. The Puritans looked, as soon as they came to these shores, they looked out and they saw a wilderness. And they didn't recognize the native people as actually human beings. Since they lived in the forest, they felt that they must be aligned with the devil. So we see the same sort of pattern that we see with the burning of women. If people were aligned with the devil, they were aligned with the forces of nature. They weren't above the beasts. They were completely dehumanized over the years. The Pequot, as a powerful nation, tried to negotiate with the colonists, and they had a fairly well standoff for a number of years. But as the colonists became stronger, they decided that they needed more land, and the Pequot were in their way. The Pequot owned vast territories, and they were willing to share some of that, but they needed those lands for their own populations. So I think that all started working on the Puritan mind, the idea that these people were allied with the devil. The Puritans also missionized the Indians, but instead of bringing them into the folds of the Puritan communities, they set up separate praying towns. There were missionaries like John Eliot who set up these separate towns and totally separated the Christian converts from their relatives, the Pequot and the Puritans. One of the elders of the colonists said, "There are 3,000 miles of wilderness behind these Indians, enough solid land to drown the sea from here to England. We must free our land of strangers." And strangers in this context meant any people who didn't believe as they did, and this included some of the non-Puritan believers near the river. And on his ship or small boat, they found about 10 or 12 Pequot men, and they found the body of this man who had been killed. And instead of asking what happened or what's going on here or anything, the Puritans immediately killed a number of the Pequots. The rest of the Pequots who were on this boat, they bound their hands and feet, and they went into they took them out to sea, and they threw them overboard. And no one actually knew exactly what had come down here. It was just an incident that was very volatile on both sides. A few weeks later, a group of Puritans landed on Block Island, the New England community that we think of as a tourist community now. And they went after the Pequots, and they said the Pequots didn't know what was going on. They had no idea what these Puritans were there for, and they kept asking them, "Why are you so angry?" And they refused to fight with them, and the Puritans were dressed in armor, their weapons, and they were trying to engage the Pequots in battle, and the Pequots, just kind of went away from them and wouldn't fight with them. And they kept asking them, "Why are you so angry?" And there was never a chance for those people to sit down and talk about why they were so angry. And in the meantime, the Puritans went through and killed all the Pequots they could find. They burned the village. People ran deeper into Block Island, and they burned the village, and burned all the crops that were in the area, and left the Pequots. And that was the beginning of a long-term war between these people. Now that was it, you know, and it was called a war. And I think that one of the things that we think about in America is that there was a war between the Indians and the Americans. There was never a war. This wasn't a war. This was an aggression carried out on people who did not know the cause of any of this. And I think that exactly what happened was a genocide was dispersed. In April 1983, the Pequots put a claim in with the United States government, and they asked for $9 million. No, actually it was $900,000 in order to buy land for their people. And in 1983, President Reagan vetoed this settlement, and his explanation that it was too much to pay for these unlikely survivors of the Pequot War. And I'm going to leave here. There's many other massacres and Holocausts that we can think of. Probably the most recent anniversary of one that probably everyone is familiar with is the Wounded Knee. And just this past December, a group of Sioux, Lakota people went on. They followed the trail that Bigfoot and his band of people went on 100 years ago, and many people were on horseback following the same trail. And this has been going on for 5 years now, who go all over the United States in wagon trains. Those people also joined in on it. And horsemen from the Lakota Nation and the Cheyenne Nation joined in on this horse ride to follow Bigfoot's trail. And I hope that that's something that can give us all hope, that even out of something as terrible as the thousands of Holocausts that occurred here in the United States, that people can still come together after all of that.
Even though I didn't get an introduction, I get to sit at the table.
Oh, you go.
I have a 25-minute introduction.
Oh.
I think my three colleagues have certainly said a lot of things to which I would like to make some, but I have written a paper instead. I don't like to write papers to read to classes. I have extensive notes for all my classes, and I rarely look at them. Today I'm, however, going to read a very short paper to you. I kind of feel like I own this room. I teach a couple of classes in here that are just about this size, and I want to get up and move the table and make these people go away so I can take over my class.
Well, we can
But
oblige you.
that's
if
not going to
what-
happen.
Oblige you if you like.
That's not what's going to happen, and they have been so loose and remiss in the use of the words genocide and Holocaust that if I made them all leave, they might say that that was genocidal. I'm going to talk about the meanings of two words, Holocaust and genocide. I'm not going to talk about it descriptively. I'm not going to talk about what somebody says it means. John said that according to a sociology text, it meant a certain thing. Bob Brown very helpfully summarized the UN Charter, the UN Charter on Genocide, Convention on Genocide, thank you. Victoria told us how she uses the word, and I have several questions I'd like to ask her after this, but I'm going to postpone those to the end. What I'm going to do, what philosophers do with words, is they prescribe how people ought to use them, and I'm going to propose to do that today for my esteemed colleagues. The meaning of a couple of words, genocide and Holocaust. This is what philosophers do. We talk about words. This has led a lot of people to suspect that it's a matter of nothing but words, 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 and I am willing to accept that charge. But there's nothing wrong with someone, a craftsman, taking care of his tools, and words are the tools of thinking. And when they are mistreated and used badly, that is not a good sign for the craft of thinking. All right. Along with the two types of Holocaust and genocide, I'm going to bring up a couple of other ones that I think are in the family of relationships where these notions get discussed fairly frequently and importantly. They are, after all, very important concepts, Holocaust and genocide, and I do not think they ought to be lightly misused. So I'm going to give you a set of cautionary warnings about the uses of these words, and I'm going to do this because I think that in large measure, what you say determines what you are. What you say determines what you are. If you talk like a football fan, then you are a football fan. If you talk like a racist, then you are a racist. And I think this identification of speech style and self that we choose is an accurate claim, because in a very crucial sense, we choose the community we want to be a member of by imitating a certain style of speaking. With their son, I don't understand anything he says. And I choose not to learn that vocabulary too much because I don't want to be 13 anymore. I just want to translate a little bit back and forth between our communities. So again, I want to stress, nothing identifies us more than the way we speak. So the moral here is be careful what you say. Now, to get into the heart of all this, as I move into it, I want to point out that words do essentially two different kinds of things. Nouns, especially like genocide and Holocaust. They describe something. They name a certain range of things or events. They describe something. But words are also used evaluatively. We express our attitudes toward them. We approve or disapprove of them. So when I say the word genocide, that's partially descriptive. It means a certain set of activities. And when I use the word, I also am using it evaluatively and I'm condemning the practices. So we can't forget these two things. Every noun has this descriptive tension that's built into it. That's not a problem. That's part of the richness of the language. Thus, for example, if you say the word priest, that has both a descriptive power, names a range of social roles played by people in black suits with turned around collars. And if you're walking down the street and you say, here comes a priest, let's go to the other side. You've said two things, or let's get a blessing, whatever. You're both naming something, describing it, and disapproving of it. Okay. This evaluative descriptive tension is right there in the heart of language, and it's hard but not impossible to find words that do strictly one or the other. But you can find some, or some that come close. For example, the word pencil is mostly descriptive, and I don't think when we say that word that it's very powerful in its evaluative domain. I did have a friend once who went to an Army school where they taught him to kill with a number 2 pencil. And being a witty man, he could not resist raising his hand and saying to the instructor, which works best, number 2 or number 3? And so he was, and for him now the word pencil is evaluative and he has difficulty coping with it. Okay. The word good, by contrast, is obviously an evaluator word. We call something good, we mean we approve of it. We call something bad, we mean we disapprove of it. So genocide and Holocaust carry both of these heavy duties right at their heart. Now, phase of my discussion, I want to say that when it comes to crucial words like Holocaust and genocide, it is nearly impossible to separate the descriptive and the evaluative dimensions of the word's meanings. To say genocide is always to describe a certain set of awful, unthinkable practices, and at the same time to evaluate those practices. Nonetheless, it is absolutely crucial that we try to make the distinctions, even with these two words, because if we fail that, we may get entangled up in some language and thus perhaps unwillingly become members of a community we would never freely and consciously join. Let me offer then the following clarification. I'll repeat a little of this. And I don't mind doing that because this is the first time some of you have heard these things. I'm going to repeat something of what John said and something of what Bob said. The term Holocaust is from the Greek holos, meaning whole, and meaning burnt. So then it's a complete burning, a thorough destruction, a conflagration in one sense. Literally then the term Holocaust is used to describe widespread destruction, generally by fire. Bob made this point with a small h. And the distinction he made between the small h Holocaust and the large h Holocaust is very important in what I'm saying here today. Etymologically, part of the sense of Holocaust is that of a burnt offering, and the term actually occurs somewhere early in Genesis, and I have a note somewhere in a file which I couldn't find. I could tell you exactly where, but it refers there to that too. So it has a long history of meaning a kind of burnt offering. for that very reason, some people have proposed that what happened between 1932 and 1945 in Europe to the Jews, but also to gypsies and other people, should not be called a Holocaust. I don't think that's a good argument, but I think you ought to know about this use of the word. Now, generally, with a capital H, the term Holocaust is used to describe the events that took place in Nazi Germany between 1932 and 1945, and not just in Germany, in Hungary and Poland and lots of other places, principally in Eastern Europe. Historically, the Jews were, in fact, the primary targets of this Holocaust, capital H. Because this attempted extermination involved racial factors, the primary criteria used for picking out the victims was race, in some spurious sense employed by Hitler. The term genocide was coined to name this event. The term genocide is itself etymologically from the Greek, genos, meaning race, and the Latin, cidium, meaning slaying. Insofar as a Holocaust is based on racial criteria, massive destruction selected by race, then the terms Holocaust and genocide are roughly synonymous. In current usage, the terms Holocaust and genocide have lost their hard edge of descriptive meaning. Indeed, I've heard my colleagues help pounce all over that hard edge. Insofar as they are now, in current usage, widely employed to express disapproval of any condition of massive dislocation in which some one group is said to oppress another. So any kind of massive conflict between two groups where one side is fairly heavily destroyed it's in vogue now to call this genocidal or holocaustal. And I'm going to object to that usage as not adding at all to the attempt to think clearly about something as awful as the Holocaust. Thus, as Victoria has done, some would argue that the American and European treatment of Indians and Africans, I want to bring in, constitute two different genocides. Others, and I have had conversations with this about people on this campus, have said that the civil wars in El Salvador and Guatemala constitute something like genocides or Holocaust. Still others have argued that the mass murders carried out as state policy under Stalin and Mao are Holocaust. Everywhere you turn, you have a Holocaust. Others have said that the Cambodian attempt by Pol Pot to eliminate a certain class of his own people constitutes a Holocaust or a genocide. I've heard it referred to as both things. Little, however, is to be gained for the clarity of moral language if the terms Holocaust and genocide become descriptively empty terms that only express the political outrage of some political critic or other. When I do that, I'm as guilty as anybody else. But I don't do it. Thus, without trying to arbitrarily rule on the case of the American Indians or any of the other cases, let me start the sentence. Thus, without trying to rule arbitrarily on the application of the terms genocide and Holocaust to some of the cases I have just mentioned, it is fairly clear that fairly rigorous criteria exists for the descriptive use of the term. What do they mean? What do they refer to? What do they name? It is also clear that moral language is rich enough in its vocabulary of disapproval so that we can disapprove of a lot of these cases without using the vocabulary of genocide and Holocaust, if in fact we decide that those terms are inappropriate. Whatever happened to the American Indian, it was awful, and we have lots of ways to condemn it morally, but we don't need to be descriptively inaccurate about it. Whatever to American blacks under slavery was awful, and the English language is rich enough to find ways to condemn that without misusing the language of Holocaust and genocide. It is very clear that the paradigm, a philosophical word that means a very clear model of, is very clear that the paradigm of genocide is to be found in the Nazi period from 1932 to 1945. Given this paradigm, it is difficult to see the sense in which the mass murders of Stalin and Mao, for example, should be called genocidal or holocaustal. In neither case were the target victims of Mao or Stalin chosen primarily because of their ethnic identity. That leaves out the genocide criteria. Now, although both were totalitarians, the victims of Mao and Stalin generally shared a kind of ethnic identity with misers. So clearly genocide is not the right word. Perhaps the word we need to describe the depredations of Mao and Stalin is Holocaust, small h. Let's see what we think of that after taking a look at the paradigm of the Nazi Holocaust of 1932-1945. That paradigm, that perfect model of what we mean by the concept of Holocaust, reveals a four-stage Holocaustal pattern. I want to use not only capital H, meaning 1932 to 1945, and small h, Holocaust, to refer to other things that might be like that, but I want to use an adjective that I made up called Holocaustal. Holocaust-like things, acts of destruction that approach in their viciousness the character of a Holocaust, whether capital H or small h. So what is this four-stage pattern we find? First, what happens is there is some way to select out and identify the targeted victims. And this consisted, in that case, with the assignment of internal passports and forcing Jews to wear yellow stars. This made it easy for everybody in Germany and Eastern Europe to recognize them. You quickly, first thing you do in a Holocaust is separate out the victims, and so it's publicly clear to everyone exactly who the target is. The second thing that takes place is there is a more radical isolation of the target victims in places that only they, the victims, are allowed to live, and over which they have relatively minimal power. This is the process of ghettoization. The Warsaw Ghetto is the paradigm of this. You isolate a people in a part of a city and say they can't get out, and you utterly control their external relations with the rest of the world. Third, there is the construction of phase 3, the building of slave labor camps, which radicalizes still further the isolation of the group of targeted victims, and which further destroys the autonomy both of that group as a society or community and the individual autonomy of people in that group. In a ghetto, in the second phase of the Holocaust paradigm, there may be some modest degree of individuals left. In the slave labor camp, this is reduced to an absolute modicum, and I am sitting next to someone who can tell me about that. These are concepts I'm introducing. I don't mean here to be describing something that I know experientially about. I only know what I have read. And the final and fourth stage of a Holocaust, there is the terminal Holocaustal event, the construction of extermination camps, explicitly extermination camps. The victims are totally under the sway of something called the totalizing background framework that is employed by the victimizers to manipulate their victims. Given this four-stage Holocaustal pattern, it is a complex, descriptive, and analytical problem to determine which of the many awful things that human beings have done to each other, some of which I have mentioned earlier, actually constitute Holocaust with a small h, or might be in an early Holocaustal phase. I'm not trying to say to John, or to Bob, or to Victoria that human beings are any nicer than they have tried to portray them. In fact, if given the time, I'd be happy to extend their rather dark portrait. But I do want to be careful about how we say the words Holocaust and genocide. I want to say that for two reasons. I'm jumping around in my paper now. If I start doing this, this is going to last another 3 hours. So it'll pick up from the sentence here, and we'll get back to that. So we got the criteria, 4 phases. Question: what kinds of awful events in human history merit the application, these appellations, genocide or Holocaust? Now, it is fairly clear that no pattern of social intimidation of one group by another can be called a Holocaust if it does not enter phase 4 of the paradigm, or a genocide. A genocide is just a particular kind of Holocaust. You don't have a Holocaust or a genocide unless you have a special mechanism whose only purpose is the elimination of the targeted group of victims. To employ the term Holocaust when this 4th phase does not exist is to trivialize the concept of a Holocaust. And that in turn contributes to the decline of the language of moral critique which you and I need to preserve at all costs. It preserves, it rises if we extend the range of the meanings of these terms, the very activity of taking moral stances on political issues. carried out far enough, what I am calling here this trivialization of the concepts of genocide and Holocaust, become little more, in the end, becomes little more than sloganeering. In that situation, when we're just in the slogan exchanging phase, words, as Humpty Dumpty said, mean whatever we want them to mean when they want them to mean it. And I think what we're studying in here is too important to let that be the case. With these remarks at hand, it might be helpful to see if the term, small h, Holocaust, fits one or the other of the above cases. Thus, for example, to what extent did the practices of the Soviet Union under Stalin constitute a Holocaust? I've said before I don't think it is. Now I'm going to say why. It is fairly clear, and I would love to condemn Stalin as being guilty of genocide or a Holocaust. I mean, I would love to be able to do that. But the restraints that I impose on the use of this language won't allow me to do it. Now, it is fairly clear that the Soviet use of internal passports to control the movement of dissidents, the use of internal exile, if you're bad they send you to Gorky or Minsk or Pinsk, and the construction of slave labor camps to further isolate Soviet dissidents constitutes the first of a Holocaust very clearly. You give them passports so they can't move around. You exile them to other cities, and then if necessary you send them away to a slave labor camp. But now it's also very clear that Stalinism, even in its worst excesses, did not move into phase 4. There was no construction of termination camps whose only purpose was the killing of the target victims. In its worst excesses, Stalinism did not go that far. So, despite all the well-documented cases of political mass murder that we have in the Soviet Union, the kulaks, the Katyn Forest massacre, and so on and so forth, one has to look to some other vocabulary to condemn the political practices of Stalinism. Mass murder seems good enough for me. Why obscure the issue by using the terms genocide or Holocaust? By the same token, let me take a case, an event in our own history that was not discussed by either of these people. And introducing these things now, I think the purpose of all this discussion is if you look at your schedule, on the last day we're going to do something like this all over again. And we'll take up these issues again when you guys are more experts and can make us stand on our toes and defend what we're saying. So this is in the order of a provocation to get the discussion going, and at the end we offer something like a final calmer. They love to talk about so endlessly but seem to know so little about racism. I'm not denying those things. It is also true, I think, that the camps to which the Japanese were exiled, however morally repugnant they were only ambiguously slave labor camps, and they were certainly not extermination camps. So it seems that the Japanese relocation during World War II is a case neither of genocide nor Holocaust. But what moral term will do for this awful act? Well, I'm going to leave this as an open question for us to mull over until we get to the last class of the semester where we can pick it up again in May. Awful act. I want to say something stronger than that, but I want you to think about it. I also don't know yet what I want to call it, so I'm using this as a didactic exercise to cover my own failure to know exactly how I want to say this. Now, I want to emphasize that my discussion cases is meant only to help clarify the concepts of genocide and Holocaust, to help clarify. The discussion is obviously not taking care of all the many details that any full discussion of them would involve. Perhaps, nonetheless, we have moved a little closer to restoring something of both their descriptive and normative power, that is to say, to the concepts of genocide and Holocaust. Discussion of one remaining from the paradigm case of the Nazi Holocaust and genocide from 1932 to 1945 will make clear, will help us move a little more certainly toward a final clarification of this. It seems to me that the thing that distinguished the Nazi Holocaust, 32, 45, from pre-Holocaustal anti-Semitism was this thing that I earlier called a background framework. And it was this background framework that empowered the Holocaustal practices, the genocidal practices of the so-called final solution, which is a phrase you're going to become acquainted with. Such a background framework employed by the Nazis is an essential element, I'm arguing today, recommending that we use it this way, Such a background framework is an essential element of any Holocaust or genocide. In Nazism, of course, this background work was a racial theory. I hate to use the word theory for something that's so awful, but that's what they call it. A racial theory that the Nazis used to justify, at least to themselves, what they were doing to the Jews, gypsies, and other of their victims. Now, as I have noted already, when the background framework is racist, the Holocaustal practices yield a genocide. But of course, the background theory need not be racist. It can have other criteria in which you isolate the targeted group of victims. And we have a case of that in only 13, 14 years ago now in Cambodia under the regime of Pol Pot. In Pol Pot's case, a case I think of a Holocaust, the background framework was classist. Pol Pot divided, I mean this to be a complete list. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, thank you. Now, Pot had then a classist's criteria background framework. You pick out your victims because they belong to the wrong class. The Nazis picked out their victims because they belonged to the wrong race. Okay. And this classist theory of Pot developed directly with some demented turns out of Marxist theory. Now, without its background race, this is what I mean, I'll be very clear about it. Without its background racist theory, the Nazi Holocaust is impossible, since it is the existence of that theory, that background racial framework, that engenders the horrendous practices of phases 3 and 4 of the Holocaust, capital H. Such background frameworks always translate the simple, I say simple here because they are simple compared to the Holocaust. Such background frameworks always translate the simple, everyday prejudice and provincialism which seem endemic to all human communities into much more demonic things. That is, a background framework constitutes the language. Remember what I said earlier, you are what you speak, you are what you say. That is, a background framework constitutes the language a group of victimizers, in this case the Nazis, adopts to utterly separate themselves from their targeted victims. This background framework is also a primary device the victimizers use to bind themselves together into a community that assumes for itself a sort of Frankensteinian power over the group of targeted victims. Remember, as you speak, so you are. The background framework of a Holocaust is then what destroys the everyday moral languages in which victims and victimizers can be seen to share some traits, in which the victim and the victimizer exist together in a kind of uneasy tension. The background framework resolves that tension and that ambiguity of prejudice so that the victimizers become utterly unrestrained in the way they treat their target group. I think you can think of lots of cases like this. The Jew and the Christian in the 1,000-year history of Europe before the Holocaust. In Nigeria, 15 years ago, the conflicts between the Hausa tribesmen and the Igbo tribesmen. The Igbo were the minority. This has gone on for a long time. Today in Salvador, El Salvador, and the conflicts between the latifundistas and the right and the peasant guerrillas. Currently in Israel, between Palestinians and Israelis. All these things exist, and these kinds of tensions exist in most human communities. And when the background framework comes along and says, hey, those victims no longer are anything like us at all, then you move into then it's possible to move in the Holocaustal phase. This is the point. Without this absolutizing separation of victim and victimizer, there can be the moral and political excesses of authoritarianism and provincialism, but there cannot be either a genocide or a Holocaust. So, this is where I think we're left. The terms Holocaust, small h, and genocide, small g, describe events that take place in totalitarian systems as gross deformations of social tensions that are present in all human worlds. Genocide is the totalitarian attempt of one ethnic group to eliminate, and not simply because the targeted group of victims lacks or possesses some trait or traits that the victimizing group finds either unacceptable or lacking. Nazis tried to exterminate Jews because they were Jews, not because of what Jews were doing. Pol Pot tried to eliminate his middle class because of what they were. And what they were was some disposable thing that did not share any trait of Cambodianness with the other Cambodians. In both these kinds of cases, when we were in the Holocaustal practices phase, the victim group was irredeemable, without any even potential merit. And just as an aside, I think that one of the things that distinguishes the American treatment of the American Indian was that this was never the purpose of it. They were fighting over land and space, and however awful the practices were, they were not genocidal and holocaustal. Now, if we forget the sort of distinctions I have tried to draw in this discussion, the results are that we destroy the richness of both the descriptive and the evaluative components of the political and moral languages we so need in these awful times. Through the destruction of these terms, we render ourselves unable to commemorate, key word here, if we just use them as terms of disapproval, we render ourselves unable to commemorate the Holocaust that took place in Europe between 1932 and 1945, and we do so precisely because we have trivialized that event by using the words genocide and Holocaust as words that only express our disapproval. Disapproval may very well be merited. But, after all, we are here to commemorate the capital H Holocaust, to learn from it. To commemorate means to keep something clearly in memory. It means, in the case of the Holocaust, to honor the memory of all the victims, those who died and those who survived. To honor the victims of the Holocaust, capital H, means to be reminded of what must be avoided in human life, the totalizing of social life and social conflicts under background frameworks that render us demonic. Otherwise, we ourselves may come under the sway of some new totalizing language that creeps upon us and is designed to entrap us, either as victims or victimizers. Thank you.
John, could I suggest that we go right to the questions, because I don't think we're going to have enough
Well,
time.
let me just say that when I said earlier, you can see we have very different perspectives, which doesn't mean that we disagree with each other. We just
Yes,
look
it
at the
does.
same. Right? So we can also say we disagree with some of the things we say, which doesn't mean that we are wrong and they are right, or they are right and we are wrong. But there are different perspectives, and the chances are that sooner or later we will come to terms with those differences which need to be, so to speak, quote unquote, thought out and clarified. Now, this will happen, but I think we've got some other things in mind right now, namely to respond to some questions might have a greater importance over what the differences are between us, if there are any.
Dr. Steiner, at the beginning of this, you very specifically mentioned how Saddam Hussein was responsible for gassing the Kurds, basically his own people. Is that correct? But recently I've heard, I haven't read any hard and fast facts, but I have heard from people who have read several things that he is not solely to blame, that Iran is partially to blame for that as well. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, I've read a very similar thing, that indeed Iran had a hand in it as well. But you see, the thing is,
and
again,
the Turks. And the Turks.
The Turks were more responsible for the Armenians.
No, they're doing it now to the
There are Kurdish populations in all three of those areas. And
But the Turks are for the massacre of the Armenians. If we don't want to call it if we don't want to call it Holocaust, because maybe we shouldn't. But it was a massacre, and they were to be exterminated, and to a large extent it happened.
That was in the past, but with the Kurds, it's happening now. As a matter of fact, a group of us were in Turkey this summer, and we were at universities where lectures were held, and we raised this question.
Moral implications of a great act of human destruction. Well, we should keep in mind the distinction between the principals who are involved and the accomplices. Because when you start talking about moral implications, it seems to me that you have a widening circle. So if you're really going to start talking about where does responsibility lie in connection with the gassing of the Kurds, first you have to establish if it did take place. Next you have to establish who are the principals involved, and then you have to decide who are the accomplices who are involved, which raises questions of who furnished the technology for the Iraqis to use. And see, that same question comes up with the Holocaust. You have to make distinctions between principals and accomplices if you're going to get at the moral truth of such actions in history.
Bob, could you ever decide if the United States had signed the UN Convention or not? So far it
I
hasn't.
think they finally did, but they didn't. It took them years and years and years to define it, and finally they only to sign it, and finally they only did it as a result of a political deal. It wasn't that. Let me add to that. I don't want to mislead you. The restrictions. The question was whether or not the United States had ever signed a convention on genocide.
We were a major holdout.
We're a major holdout. Now, what you have to keep in mind is, I don't want to mislead you here, the major obstacle for the United States signature was the belief on the part of a relatively small number of political figures in the United States who were afraid about questions of national sovereignty of the United States in terms of the Genocide Convention.
Bob, after hearing you paraphrase the UN Genocide Convention, I think I understand fully why the United States didn't sign it, because it's filled with exactly the kind of vacuous misuses of the word genocide that I was condemning.
Well,
let me see if I paraphrase you.
But there's one thing that you didn't address, Harold, which I think is a great gap.
Let's deal with the things I addressed.
Let me just add that you didn't address the idea of intent. Intent is a very important element.
It's very important to point out that words change, and new generations come up with new uses for words. And, you know, I could say, like, funky fresh for the 90s, and you wouldn't know what I was saying. And I see more and more, I see young people using those words, Holocaust and genocide, more often genocide, to point to devastating elements of the current society. And they have no idea the origin of the word. They have done no research on any of the previous genocides. They have literally no knowledge of where it comes from, and they're still using the word. And I think they're using it very effectively to at least alert each other to possible to their personal safety.
Well,
and I think what happens, you know, we get trapped in this scholarly environment here, and we forget that there's 5 billion people out there, and the vast majority of them don't know half the things we know, and they cannot use words nearly as specifically as you use words. They cannot even begin to realization that a word can be that specific and that accurate in its definition and its use. And when we have a president who uses things like peacekeeping missile and patriot missile and abuses the language, you know, as bad as the rest, should busy yourself with the reality that's going on now and start coining those words to describe the destruction and the brutalities that are going on now.
I absolutely agree with all that. And one of the things I was trying to say was, when the language of morality gets so inflated that it has no weight anymore, when the real awful events of your time occur, you may not recognize them because you're going around calling everything a Holocaust and a genocide. That's part of my...
That's a very good point, but also...
No, somebody else, please.
Over here,
yes.
I'd like to say that that's the very point that this man is trying to make, that we have to use these words today because the situation has become so strange. And also I think that when we use these words for the events of the past that we know about, for instance, the history of the American Indians and North America, that we are able to apply this So where
Exactly.
people like to close their eyes, just like the Germans like to close their eyes towards what happened to the Jews and the other people that were not Nazis. But we also have to have the courage to do that in this country and in other countries. And I think also I agree with you that we shouldn't overuse it. But just what this man is saying, that when we use these words and we're trying to set people straight about what is happening, like ecocide, it means to kill the environment, culture side, it means to kill people, culture and ethnic identity, and that is what happened with the American Indians. And why we are using it for Guatemala, for instance, is because we know that there is a plan, a systematic extinguishing of the native peoples there. And it's not because we like to throw around big words, it's because we have learned from what has happened and we're trying to make people responsible and take action. And so, as I agree with you that you have to be careful, we are careful, and because we have that linguistic knowledge and the historical knowledge, because of that, we're using these terms, because we want to be responsible and not have our eyes closed. And that's what we have to use with all these words of peace that are being misused right now. And for your last point of having a framework, a conscious framework, and I think what happened with the American Indians is that we call it the Indian Wars, but as Victoria said, largely those were plans to kill the people. Maybe the soldiers didn't understand themselves, but the generals and the US government certainly had the knowledge that they were extinguishing the native peoples of the country. And your other point that they had to have a stigma or some otherness, they certainly did. They were pagans and they were not Europeans. And so on contact they had to be eliminated so that they, the Europeans, could take over their land. So I think we have to, I agree with you, we have to understand the language, but we have to be very careful with how we use the language.
I just wanted to identify for the class Ilsa Hartman, who is a faculty member of the Holocaust Commission, and she will be on different panels, so is one of the faculty.
We still.
My response to that is I appreciate the passion of your insistence on using these words appropriately and not being afraid to use them where they are really needed. I think I, however, would disagree with you in some of the cases you mentioned, since I don't think the factual data is there to support the use of the terms. And if it does become just an inflated moral category, Holocaust, genocide, then we can't identify those awful things do occur. You said that the facts show that there is a genocidal campaign in Guatemala and El Salvador. I don't think that any such facts exist, and it would be nice at some point to discuss that. In fact, I think you must have come in late because you repeated some of the things I said in the early part of my paper. Okay.
Could we take this gentleman up here, please?
Since the philosophy professor seeks for precision in language, wouldn't it be more right to call tragedy of the Jews in World War II a semi-genocide and a quasi-Holocaust?
No, it was called,
Since
no. No, the intention was there. Phase 4 was there. They were doing it. The fact that they didn't succeed doesn't exempt anybody from anything. That's not an interesting point.
Well, the intent was indeed to totally eradicate them. There is no question about that. That was Hitler's intent, and I think that should not be.
An attempt. That's the point.
Intention.
Intent. And that was very clearly and also documented.
Yes.
Could I just add, I think that what we call the Holocaust with a capital H is both a Holocaust and a genocide.
Sure.
It's both.
It's a case of a genocide, except it's called, or better known, or worse known under the name Holocaust, and capital H. Yes. Let me see. Yes.
For Dr. Aldernman, again, on the trivialization of words and trivialization of language here. There's also a type of language that I know our Native American guest here is very familiar with. That's picture language. And what I'm referring to is the swastika. And what we are seeing today as considered juvenile. This is the way the police look at it. If the swastika is painted as graffiti somewhere, if it is not directly if they don't find any direct connection to a major Nazi organization, it's considered a prank. Now, you spoke about, what I'm concerned about is this 13 or 15-year-old that does that. What the swastika is going to mean to him when he's 23 and 25 if he keeps on doing this. And I am curious about what you, Dr. Aldernman, are going to do when your 13-year-old son comes home and says he heard that somebody painted the swastika, somebody from his class maybe. Now you say you can't talk to him.
No,
You've got a problem.
I made a rhetorical point about the differences in languages.
I know.
We talk all the time.
But that is,
He does most of it.
important. That's also part of this trivialization. That's what I'm getting at, part of this trivialization.
Yes.
I have a problem. The way you want to describe and privilege the uses of language, I think that can result in a very subtle form of suppression. As Victoria was trying to bring up the plight of the American Indian, if we're going to privilege the word Holocaust strictly for the, what happened to European Jews, I mean, it has a tendency to suppress others.
Well, I didn't say that. I said I wanted to derive from the Holocaust, the four-stage model, what a Holocaust was. And if it's appropriate, then to use that concept. But if it's not, then you do no service to the memory of the victims who died, nor do you do any service to the thing you're trying to describe and evaluate. What happened to the American Indians, as I said in the first part of my paper, was awful. That's not a strong enough moral language, but it seems to me that it's inappropriate to talk about it under the other two categories. Victoria respond to this later or now? Or?
Well, I would like to respond to this because as far as stages go, I think that there are stages, and I think that we've probably looked at different stages of life, different stages of birth, different stages of, the passages of our life, stages of grief, different things like that. And what you come up with a lot of times when you look at those things is that they may happen not in order. They may happen one at a time and follow some sort of pattern, or they may happen all at once. And I think one of the things that happened with Native American people was, and it's still going on, I don't think it's stopped. I don't think that there has been a cessation of the pre-Holocaust and whatever, and also a Holocaust and a genocide. One of the things that one of the captains that went with the troops to deal with the Pequot Indians, what he said is he wanted to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth. Okay, that was the intent of this. That was the intent, to completely do away with every Pequot that was living at that point. I don't think that, I think that we do have to use strong language, and we do have to be quite aware of what's going on in the world. In Guatemala, I happened to spend, I've never been to Guatemala, but I happened to spend a few years working with Guatemalan refugees, particularly Mayan and Quiche. And I interviewed a number of those people who had fled for their lives in the mountains. These people were not guerrillas. They were Indian people. They were Mayans. They were Quiche. They were different types of Indian people. And what was going on was a systematic killing of the people they wanted to call Indians. They collapsed all of those people down into Indian people. It didn't matter whether they were from what region they were from, what language they spoke, any of that. They were Indians. And it was very hard to deal with. It went on to mass murder. It went to the point where there were many villages where there were no survivors. There were people who, during the times they were fleeing, they dropped their children in the mountains, and they could never find them. So it was really a terrible, horrible time, and that was in the early 80s. Those kinds of things, that genocide that occurred, has lessened, it's abated. But at every political turn, it reoccurs. And right now, as far as I know, things have started to heat up a little bit more. And we have to be aware of that tendency toward genocide, because it happens to our people. And by that I mean Native people, tribal people. It happens over and over again.
Victoria, let me be clear about what you're saying, that the Holocaust is still going on with respect to...
Well, one of the things that you mentioned was slave labor, for instance. And I think it can be very subtle. Reservations are places where Native American people live. Those are lands set aside for Native people. By curious tricks of language and laws and below. And sort of, you know, they are the slave labor in effect. And I don't mean to, you know, and I'm not trivializing this in any way, because many of the people are malnutritioned, are, even today in 1991, our life expectancy is 45 years of age. And, you know, that's uncalled for, a country that's supposedly modern. And, you know, that's what we're seeing on reservations. That's the mean age.
It occurred to me as I was listening to this debate about semantics, what should be called a Holocaust and genocide, and what should not, that while indeed language accuracy must be emphasized, we have to be careful what we call things. That, and I don't want to get into the questions about the application of the terms Holocaust and genocide, because it's I think we've raked that over the coals enough by this point. While that is all important, I think that it's even more important for us to be aware of facts that have to do with the phenomena that we attach this word
or that word to. And if we don't get our information straight about what's going on here or there in a place that we might call a Holocaustal place, or we might not, depending on what the evidence shows, if we don't get that evidence, then we're at the whole point. And what we call it is totally irrelevant. The important thing, it seems to me, in talking about the American Indians is precisely the information about what happened to them and how it was done. It seems to me, Harold, that if you say that it was essentially a dispute about land ownership, ignoring the racist aspects of it, and ignoring the other, I mean, it seems to me that the four criteria that you named for the application of the term Holocaust apply in spades to the Indian experience. We could get into that, but I don't want to. But if we ignore the important facts about the respective phenomenon, for example, if we ignore the facts that Victoria has adduced about what went on with the Indian populations during the early 80s in Guatemala, well, then clearly we're going to be tempted to trivialize the whole thing, and we're going to be tempted not to want to apply extreme and powerful terms like Holocaust to them. But it seems to me that the emphasis should first be on the information, the accuracy of it, and the in many events, the horror of it. And I would further point out that that dearth of information that affects all of us, including scholars like you and me who like to talk about words, that dearth of information is also one of the main factors of the current situation that's going on that has all of us so gut-wrenched, namely the Gulf War. And that what we need is to know facts. Once you've got the fact, then it makes much more sense to talk about niceties of language and what word you're going to apply to which set of facts.
Thanks very much. I think that was a very helpful comment. Thank you very much.
Could we only take about three more? There's a young woman there and over here, and then there was one young man up in back, I think. And then we're going to have to, I think, we're going to be at this for 15 weeks, ladies and gentlemen. So you will have time.
It should be actually...
So this young lady...
50? What is it, 50?
Yeah, we're going to... It's a cultural genocide.
According to Irving Lewis Horowitz, a well-known American sociologist, in a book called Taking Lives, no. So the dispute exists there.
Who are you going to believe, Lewis or the Genocide Convention of the UN? Over here?
Well, from what you read of it, Bob, I would say Lewis.
I guess all I had to say was that I think what Dr. Aldernman is saying really enlightened me a lot, because I think the subject will preserve all the intensity those words have.
And the young man, I'm not quite sure who it was, up here?
Anyone there?
Okay. I want to make one final remark, very quickly.
Again.
Victoria Bomberry, I would like to invite back for the last seminar, because I really want to talk to her some more.
I hope so.
And I don't want her to get away
now and then.
before then. But I mean explicitly to be on the last panel where we take up this issue.
Do we have the faculty members who are going to handle the different groups down here, please?
That's a red pen.
Why did you leave out the idea of ideology that
That's the
flows in
background.
your
That's the background framework. That's
Why
what
do you
that is.
use such